Yeah.
Okay. So thank you all for joining today. Very excited for this brain health and wellness class. My name is Sabrina Bonaparte. For those of you who don't know me, I am the board president of the Brain Injury Alliance of Washington. We are very excited to have Dan here with us for the next 3 weeks, doing three very amazing talks about breaking down brain injury as part of our brain health and wellness courses, which are, of course, always free, always recorded, then always posted on our YouTube page later, so you could come back and watch it. As we mentioned, this is being recorded, so if you have any questions about personal information or things you don't want on a public recording, you're welcome to ask those, but we just ask that you wait until after we turn the recording off later. So at the very end, we'll turn it off if anyone has any personal questions that they want to ask. But other than that, yeah, I just want to turn it over to Dan. Very excited. Thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you. Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you for hosting this, allowed me to do this presentation. Okay, so I see my slides, I see people, I see the chat on the side, but as long as you all can see my slideshow, then I will proceed. So I want to thank Amy for this title, Breaking Down Brain Injury. This presentation is going to be 3 parts. And okay. Now I cannot read my disclaimer because I cannot see it because the other things are in the way. So bottom line is that I wanted to share my ideas and share my thoughts, but the ideas expressed here in this BIAWA presentation are intended for educational information purposes only. I am sharing my opinions and observations and my evaluation of. With my brain injury, I got stuck in my head observing what was happening in me, and I've kind of applied that to the rest of the world as I meet more brain injured people. So this is observation. This is comes from personal experience, and anything that I say here is not intended to substitute for professional medical or therapeutic advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always go with the advice and treatment of a qualified healthcare provider. And if you have any questions about brain injury treatment, diagnosis, and we're all dealing with it, speak to those types of people. This is not intended to replace or substitute anything in that nature. And never disregard the advice of a professional clinician or therapist with what you've heard in this series. So with that, I am a brain injured person. I had a traumatic brain injury when I was 18 years old. I don't have any pictures. My mom was with me in the hospital. She's of a time and generation where she didn't take any pictures. No one took anything about anything. This is the car I was in. I was in the back seat of that car. It landed, I guess, on a guardrail, crushing my head in. I was airlifted to Cedar Sinai and had a pretty quick brain
Harry Potter
surgery.
do we want to watch?
Sorry?
Jenny on them.
Someone say something? Anyway, so I had a brain injury when I was 18 and a long, strange recovery. I say about 7 to 11 years, but really continues every day. It's just changed. So you know what? I'm in a problem here because I need to move these windows, otherwise I can't read my slides. Okay, I hope you can all see me. I'm just going to proceed, but I can't see anyone. So the goals of this series is to characterize and describe the invisible features of brain injury problems. Another synonym for brain injury problems is symptoms. And this is the goal of this is to help people with brain injury to make better sense of what they are dealing with, and to help brain injury people find ways to improve and find ways to improve their overall conditions. Also, injured people about what we are dealing with. I hope to record this session and hopefully record some of the discussion, because I think that a lot of what I've learned from other brain injured people has only corroborated and confirmed what I have dealt with, and it would be good to at least capture some of that to share with others. So like I said before, this is that disclaimer again, but the ideas I share come from my experiences, observation, and discussion with brain injured people and my understanding of neuroscience. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and this presentation is not intended to substitute for professional medical or therapeutic advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare professional, and never disregard any professional advice because of something you've heard on this series or from me, period. So here are the characteristics of brain injury problems that I want to focus on in this talk. Just start, listing them. There's brain injury is many problems. These problems can be characterized as strange and stranger than strange. There is a interconnectivity, or connectivity might be a better word. Again, I'm making up these terms. You can feel free to use them or supplant your own terms. Constantness, the constantness of brain injury problems is something that needs to be discussed. The evolving nature, and last but not least, and probably the most important, is the invisible nature of brain injury. So I'm just going to get into all of these. The first characteristic of brain injury problems is that there are many brain injury problems. So brain injury is not just one thing, rather there are many issues. And by issues, I'm talking about each person has a long list of internal problems. And I used to tell people, or once I finally started telling people, I'm brain injured, I realized that they don't really understand what I'm talking about, or I had a brain injury, they don't understand what that means. So there are many issues, many problems, and these problems should be thought of, or it's helpful to think about them as underlying the problems that the outside world sees and is aware of. Also, with these brain injury problems and symptoms, sometimes awareness of them is very clear, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the awareness and building awareness of what that problem is can be very difficult to gain and sort of capture in your head. So the topic of awareness of brain injury problems will be covered in detail in the next presentation. The next characteristic of brain injury problems are that they're strange and stranger than strange. And these are terms that I made up. I feel like it's accurate. You guys can tell me what you think. The strange problems are the ones that the world around us is aware of. So here's a list from the CDC, traumatic brain injury, concussion, and brain injury symptoms. And they have a nice table here. And I'll just kind of read down the line. There are physical symptoms there, and which include bothered by light and noise, overall sensory sensitivity, people know about that, dizziness or balance problems, feeling tired, no energy, headaches, nausea and vomiting, vision problems as well. The next column is thinking and remembering. People are aware that people can have problems with attention and concentration, feeling slowed down, brain fog and grogginess, problems with short or long-term memory, troubles thinking. For social and emotional, they do have awareness of anxiety or nervousness, irritability and anger, feeling more emotional, sadness, and with sleep. I'm glad they have this column here, sleeping less than usual, more than usual, for trouble falling asleep. But here's another similar table from the Brain Injury Association of America. Now, I'm not going to go through this one in detail, but they do include the seizures, the nausea for physical. They include spasticity and problems swallowing, balance issues. For cognitive, they have judgment and decision problems, slower processing speed, word finding. So my point is that these symptoms are very strange, and when you experience it, it's really hard to deal with, but at least sometimes you can find someone or a clinician that understands and knows about these. They have an interesting little passage here on bottom. It says, this list encompasses the most common symptoms that brain injury survivors may experience, but there are others, more obscure effects that can occur. One of these is called pseudobulbar effects, which is involuntary, uncontrollable episodes of laughing and crying. Another one is spasticity. And so it's important then to recognize that indeed there are all these strange symptoms, and then there are stranger than strange brain injury problems that the world does not really know about. And I felt like I had a lot of these. So I have a podcast, some of you may be aware of, it's called Experiencing My Brain. And I get into detailed discussion with brain injured people about what they're dealing with. And I find it's almost like a strange characteristic, especially when I meet someone for the first time, when we get into a discussion of their problems, they will say something like, well, it's hard to explain, but then they will go on to explain the internal problems that they are experiencing. And they do have some awareness of it, and they do know how to describe it, and they can, sometimes it takes years, but over time, recognize that there is a problem there. And so here is a table, and I only listed things that I have heard in my podcast or discussed with people, some of them literally this week, about stranger than strange brain injury problems. And I can read down this, but people describe loss of and brain injury problems with their perception, their sense of time, their sense of self in general, internal self, bodily self, confusion overall, injury to awareness, injury to the feeling of reality, injury to the feeling of the world, injury to their perception of faces or just faces in general don't seem right. Internal visualization, visual attention, focus and attention in general can be injured. With emotions, I listed the dysregulation, overwhelming emotions, lack of emotions. All these have come up in my discussions with people. Head pressure, like the contents of one's head is too large for the container, but other head pressures are described as well. Regression to a childlike state, drastic fluctuation in blood pressure, and head pains that are extremely, extremely painful. I'm sorry, I'm not able to look in the chat, and I'm not going to worry about it now. But so with this table, I wanted to add, so the problems here that are listed in red, or that I've changed the font to red, are problems that they occur with brain injury, and also neuroscience research has shown that brain systems and networks and processes in the brain are known, they are identified, they have the networks for perception, the networks are the cellular basis for time, the brain regions underlying self and internal self and bodily self, and all these things that are in red, there are known processes in the brain. Meanwhile, the underlying ones are the problems that I know that I had, that I experienced myself for years, some for even like 17 years, and it's improper or inaccurate to say that this is a sense of the feeling of the world, or a sense of the feeling of reality, or a sense of internal self. It really feels like injury to internal self, to the inner you being gone. Or for emotions, I had this alexithymia where there just wasn't emotions. So I can relate with some of these, but not all. To summarize the idea of strange and stranger than strange brain injury problems, I think that these problems are due to injury to brain regions, brain networks, and systems that control and create these brain functions and capacities. But the research to demonstrate that loss due to brain injury is not, that research does not exist. For most of these systems, the research to even discover that system is just kind of happening. You know, some of it has been around 50 years, some 30 years, some 10, 20 years. Some of it is just like coming out, last week or in the past year. But these systems and these processes are things that the brain does. And with brain injury, they can get injured. So even problems with memory, cognition, balance, attention, sensory issues, and dysautonomia, which is injury to the autonomic nervous system, and these things are known about by clinicians. When you actually talk to a brain injured person about it, the issues that they're dealing with are often very, very strange, very bizarre. And the particular details of what a person is dealing with are not known or not understood, or they're unique to that person's brain injury. So I just wanted to cite, and it's funny to cite this stuff, but I have the podcast where these discussions come up in every single episode. And then I have the talk series where I've been interviewing and having, presentations by neuroscientists and clinicians and people who study the brain and people who study treatment for brain injury. And the first talk that I did in that kind of tries to hit on this point, that these systems in the brain can get injured. And the talks used to be run through Synapse at the University of Oregon, but now I'm doing it on my own. It's called Building Brain Awareness to help support brain injury recovery, or BBA for short. Okay, the next characteristic of brain injury problems is this interconnectivity. And the basic idea here is that brain injury problems can connect and make other brain injury problems feel worse and more intensified. And I can think of three types of this connectivity or interconnectivity of brain injury problems that I've seen across different people, and I want to just identify and characterize at this point. The first type is just having many problems, having many, many brain injury problems inside of you. They're all internal, and that becomes a problem of its own. That becomes like this entity inside of yourself. So I call that the bizarreness. And with other brain injury people, I've discussed it. They call it the mishmash. But it's like all this stuff feels wrong, feels off, and you can't make heads or tails of it. You can't deal with it. And it just becomes a kind of overwhelming. You don't even recognize it as a series of problems because the distinguishing of it doesn't exist yet. The other issue, the topic of the fatigue that comes up with brain injury, that perpetuates and makes this overall many problem issue worse. And the topic of the fatigue with brain injury is going to be covered in the next presentation. The fatigue should be capitalized. I forgot to do that, but it's capitalized, bold, and underlined because it's so intense. The next example of brain injury problems that interconnect is this aggravation problem. So I called it the aggravation of symptoms. Specific brain injury problems that are pushed too far or are lingering and not able to be relieved or restored to, not problematic, can aggravate other brain injury problems. So I had a lot of experiences like this. The other week, for some of you, there's the Brain Network that's run by Lisa Hirsch, and we discussed the podcast episodes. And that episode that we discussed last week, the woman in that episode 16 was talking about she had these visual problems, vestibular problems, and she was pushing those limits. And then she had migraines. And so now she has all three of those problems, but it wasn't just those three, it was many others. But the pushing of certain symptoms led to other symptoms. The next podcast, the one I'm working on right now, that person, and I'm not using names because I forget the names and also don't want to call people out, but she had a term for the aggravation of symptoms. She called it the stirring up of brain injury problems. We were talking about the exact same thing. So also this aggravation of brain injury problems that leads to other problems, I think can definitely be worsened by the fatigue that comes with brain injury. The third type of interconnectivity of brain injury problems, I call the hierarchy of problems. And fortunately, I have a nice citation here. So Dr. Karen McAvoy, PhD, she's pretty amazing clinician. She's been working for over 35 years to help people with brain injury. She's the author of reapconcussion.com and getschoolonconcussion.com. She's been in schools. She's been kind of at like the government level, and then she's at a clinic now. But she did a really good talk called Finding the Right Lens to View Brain Injury Problems. And so I'll get to her slides in a second. But the idea of the hierarchy of problems is that brain injury problems, certain problems may completely overwhelm a person's ability to do other functions or other mental capacities. And therefore, it seems like those other functions are also injured when in fact it's that first problem that is so overwhelming, so domineering, that is causing the other problems to be there and to seem as bad. So she called, Dr. Karen McAvoy has a neurologist at her clinic, and he calls this needing to clear the deck. So here are her slides from her presentation that she did in the BBA talk. And her data is very interesting. So they don't have data to show all of these injuries to brain systems, but she relies on brain development. And they show these fundamental processes on the bottom in orange: memory, processing speed, attention, inhibition, and sensory motor. And these processes build in complexity, and this happens in normal development, where language, learning, visual spatial attention, and then at a higher level, social emotional competency and executive function. And finally, at the top of this pyramid is a productive citizen that can achieve, that has cognitive abilities, that can reason and just function like as per a normal non-brain injured person. I'm not saying normal exists, but I'm saying that they are unbrain injured. When a brain injury happens, it can be to one of these lower level systems or more fundamental systems. In her example, attention and memory is what she chose, but then the whole structure collapses. Meanwhile, the brain injury problems are really to those more underlying issues. And I didn't mention all the citations that she has here, but she has some pretty good data and interesting data and literature that she uses for this. And she doesn't only use this model to assess, but also to diagnose and to treat. And so in her clinic, they called this clearing the deck. The term is described to need to assess and treat these specific fundamental brain processes that are so devastating to higher order processes. And when the work is done to restore attention, to restore memory, you can also have injury to executive function. You can also have injury to cognitive or social cognition, but it needs to be figured out what's the hierarchy of these problems, if that makes sense. And I can use my experience to explain that even further. So an example of hierarchy of brain injury problems is something that I experienced. So I had many brain injury problems, but two specific ones that I had were double vision and tremendous cognitive problems. With double vision, the double vision was due to cranial nerve damage, and my eye was stuck in the corner, kind of looking in. Everything was double, everything was overwhelming. The fatigue from it was exhausting. The ability to do anything was hardly there. And fortunately, this is circa 2000. I found an experimental therapy group, and over 8 months of work, I was able to restore the vision or restore the eye movement properly enough. And only then did the testing and things show that my cognition was also a major, major problem. And it was almost like the double vision was completely blocking the cognition from even being able to be assessed and be tested and being observed. So I think these examples are good enough for pointing out this hierarchy of problems. And I believe this exists with many brain injured people. In the last podcast episode I did, episode 20 with my friend Nancy, she has this cerebral spinal fluid obstruction due to neck damage, neck injury. And that problem was another example of a hierarchy. It was preventing other problems from even being realized. It was so overwhelming. And this kind of stuff I think happens a lot. Dr. Karen McAvoy definitely attests to that in the presentation that she did. Okay, given all that, now I can get to the thing that I was trying to get to. The core problems and the ripple problems of brain injury, I think, is a characteristic for brain injury problems that should be observed, that is helpful towards assessing yourself, understanding what you might be dealing with. And I think for other people to know about this, it would be helpful. Again, this is my observation and postulation. So core brain injury problems are the injured, damaged brain systems and networks inside of us. Core problems result from specific losses or difficulties with these capacities and functions. And this can be across the range of anything that the brain does, from visual systems to emotional systems to vestibular to, it's just a huge amount. But each brain injured person has these kinds of problems. It can even be to the awareness and attention of that problem, which makes it more complicated. Core problems are often connected with that extreme fatigue. As soon as you tap into that part of your mind or your effort, the exhaustion happens. And I speak from my experience, but also observation of others. And in my experience, these core problems need to be treated and dealt with and worked on either clinically or, I don't know enough about treatment to say, but they need to be treated in order to recover. The distinction then is that the ripple brain injury problems are more the result of the core problems, plus the overuse, the strain, the fatigue, and the stress. But those problems come on, and with the right approach and the lack of stress and the lack of exhaustion, those problems are more easy to minimize. Meanwhile, the core problems remain. So these types of relationships between core and ripple problems both occur in that aggravation example and that hierarchy example of brain injury problems. I hope that's clear. Distinguishing between core and ripple problems is not easy, but as a brain injured person, the relationship between those internal problems can become apparent over time through observation. And there's so much to talk about, so I'm not going to get overwhelmed with it. But especially in the beginning of a brain injury, you have these certain issues, and then you try to push your limit, things just get worse and fall apart, and more issues come on. So I think that distinction, the right support, and all these other issues need to be tied in. But having this distinction is helpful. I'm starting to ramble. I'm going to stick to my slides. Okay. The next issue, or the next characteristic of brain injury problems, is the constantness of these problems. So constantness meaning constant, or in the clinical world, they call it a chronic feeling. So in my podcast, this comes up all the time, or at least enough that I know that other people are experiencing this too. The constantness, it either feels like this problem is always on, or it turns on once activated. For example, my double vision was always present until it was finally treated and dealt with, and that took about 8 months. But once it went away, I can't say it was gone fully, but I'll get into the better example here. But with cognitive problems, anytime I tried to think, that's when those problems began. And I've met people with executive function problems, and I've met people with other types of problems that it's like if you don't think, if you don't use it, if you don't try to tap into it, then it's not there. But as soon as you tap into that black hole, that blind spot, then that problem is present. People I've met with vestibular issues, those are always on. With visual issues, they're always on. And just to complicate things more, once my double vision was treated, when I pushed my cognitive limits too far, the double vision would come back. So then I knew that I had gone too far. So it kind of like keeps changing. But needless to say, these problems are constant in us, and I've met many people who describe it similarly. The clinical world knows about chronic pain and chronic fatigue, and those are the citations that I've been able to find. But I think there's a similar chronic or constant nature for any system that gets injured in a brain injured person, and that kind of just stays with us until it's treated or dealt with. I think people don't recognize that, or at least unbrain injured people. The second to last characteristic is the evolution of brain injury problems. So this one I was able to find some citations for. I did a presentation about 8 months ago where I presented on the National Academies of Sciences report called Traumatic Brain Injury: A Roadmap to Accelerated Progress. And they did show this evolution of brain injury problems. In the past decade, I'm just going to read what they write. In the past decade, there's been a shift from the assumption that the person with a traumatic brain injury achieves a lifelong plateau. Following an initial period of recovery to recognition of the reality first identified by Maisel and DeWitt in 2010, that a substantial portion of individuals experience late effects and evolving status. The evolving status is what I want to talk about. In some cases, patients experience recovery that is greater than initially expected, while in other cases, patients experience decline. So the evolving status of brain injury, I think, needs to be recognized. And aside from recognizing that a person is going through that, I think treatment and what clinicians use to approach us should take that into consideration. So in my experience, asking any brain injury survivor to compare their first days after a brain injury to the first weeks to the first month to the first year, things drastically change. And the changes, in my experience, is they keep happening. Some people I've met, I'm 24 years past brain injury, but if you compare by years, the first 3 years to the 5 years to the 7 years mark, things change a lot by then. But over the decades, I think things continue to change. And most brain injured people I've met do describe these problems and these changes, as well as their solutions, their approaches, and they're no longer new to this, although the problems do keep changing. So I just want to point out that this evolution or evolving status, which is hard to describe, is a feature of brain injury problem. The last characteristic of brain injury problems is that it's invisible. And this, I think, is the hardest because people don't believe us, recognize what we're saying, understand it. There's a whole level to understanding or being able to communicate your brain injury problem because of the strangeness and the stranger than strange issues. But then there's the other issue that is just invisible. You look fine. Nobody can see it. And it's because what is inside of us, what is our nervous system, is what got injured. And I don't want to elaborate on this one because I think I'll cry, but it's one of the biggest problems with brain injury, that it's invisible. But it's not, it's real, but it's invisible. Okay, so that's it for now. The characteristics of brain injury problems is where we're going to start. So in this presentation, this is part 1 of 3, and in the next presentation, we will build off of brain injury problems and delve deeper into the nature of brain injury overall. And once I have that context, then we will try to discuss what is known about, and I will share my experiences of what can be done to improve. And this slide, I was going to have all the citations prepared so people can look at it. These are all brain systems that are there. I'll have that by next week, but I do have all these sources on my computer. I just haven't prepared that slide. And lastly, I want to thank Amy and Sabrina and the BIAWA for helping me put this presentation out, and thank all of you for being here. And with that, that's it. So let's talk. Where is everyone? I can't even see you.
I spotlighted you, Dan. I will
Okay.
unspotlight you so that you can see everybody else. Okay.
Yeah, I'll share the slides. I have to I use Keynote, and when I turn it into a PDF, I turn it into, what's the other one? It always gets corrupted and weird, but if I turn it into a PDF, then it works. But yeah, I can share this, and I'm hoping to build off of this for the next talks, and in my talk series, I'm also hoping to build off of this. So, okay, that's it.
Great, thank
What
you.
do y'all think? And let's discuss.
Yeah, Dan, do you want to stop sharing your screen so that we'll all look a little bit bigger in our little squares. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. I want to say I'll work with Dan on getting these into a format that can get sent out. And then once we do that, Dan, I will take care of it. I will send it out. So make sure if you're not registered for this class, which I'm not sure how you got in, if you didn't have the Zoom link, but I'll put the registration link in the chat. Just make sure you are registered. And that way when the classes wrap up, we'll send out all the recordings, which will also be on YouTube, and we will send out the PowerPoint as well. And if
Thank
there's
you.
anything else Dan wants to send out, we can.
Yeah. Oh, like I said, it's hard for me to make a PowerPoint, but I'll make a PDF and I'll put it out. And so I
Yep.
just wanted to say, talking to people, connecting with people, it was like I didn't talk to anyone about my brain injury for about 17 years. And then once I did, it was immediate, the validation and the similarity, but the similarities are different because they keep saying every brain injury is different, and that's true. But my goal is to like create this net. How can you say what is similar? What is shared? Why do we feel validated? Why does a support group help so much? And so that's the attempt here. Is there a question? Zoomer user. There's a question. I don't know.
Yeah.
You guys should
Actually,
just
Dan, real quick, before we take any questions, I just want to remind everyone, once again, this is being recorded. So if you don't, please don't share any personal information that you don't want to show up on a recording. But other than that, feel free to share away. I just wanted to put the reminder in there that this is being recorded. So
thank you.
Mhm.
This is Aruna. I had a question, Dan. Thank you for informative presentation. My question is, you talked in the context of core problems and ripple problems, understanding what you are dealing with. Can
Yeah.
you elaborate on that? Because if I'm a mom, of course, if, my daughter, she's an adult, but if she can understand what she's dealing with and communicate, then we are better able to support her appropriately. So any guidance there? Thank you.
Yeah, that can be a big problem. For example, and I have to like speak about the examples of the people I've talked to, but some people, like one guy that I interviewed, he had this chemical brain injury that changed his visual processing, and it just got worse and worse. And his family didn't believe him, made him want to take care of it, made him want to get over it. Meanwhile, other people, I think that the brain systems and problems in us, I remember years, and I've spoken to many brain injury people where it's like you're trying to figure out what you're dealing with. You're trying to figure out what the problem is. You just run into problem and inability and inability. And then over time, the characterization starts to happen. And then with the right discussion, the right context, it's kind of like it forms in your head, but even that can be complicated because maybe someone has injury to their awareness of that. Then there's, this is what I'm going to have in the next presentation. Then there's all the denial, the confabulation, the inability to admit to yourself what's wrong. So I don't think it's a easy process, but I remember when I recognized and realized that I had this feeling that my mind was not my mind, my internal self was gone, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't know how I got to that conclusion, but then forever else, I was like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, and now I can address it. So, sometimes talking to somebody about it with my podcast, I just try to say, hey, what are you dealing with? And then as they put the words to it, I try to help. But sometimes the person cannot even put words to it, so then it becomes very hard. Maybe a good therapist or a good neuropsychologist that is aware of these problems, because now I'm realizing that certain brain injury clinicians or clinicians who work with brain injured people have a very good awareness of the types of problems, and they're not judgmental and they're not minimizing it, and they'll listen. But you have to be in the right environment, you have to be the right support, and then it's a vomiting process. I spit out the words and I try to make sense of it, and then reading papers, reading neuroscience, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. My plate is right in my parietal lobe, and it extends from frontal to visual. And I was like, oh, this self thing, what is this? And it's a hard process. I don't know how to explain it better than that, but it can be massaged and teased out and find words to it. Maybe journaling to begin with, and I have the talk series called Building Brain Awareness. Half of those talks are neuroscientists talking about, I study this system. They only study that system. They don't study what got injured when you have that system injured. But I think for brain injured people that see those talks, they're like, oh, that is the thing I injured. That is the thing that is broken, damaged, not working in me. So I don't think that this exists aside from with the brain injured people that I've spoken to. And so I don't know. It can be grown, it can be fostered, it can be massaged, it can be supported, it can be developed.
Thank you so much.
The stuff I presented here, I think just, sit and think about it, share it with people. For when I talk to brain injured people about this, half the time they're like, yeah, I know. And I'm like, yeah, I know, we're all dealing with these kinds of things. But of course it's different core problems, different ripple problems. Many people that don't have support, it's like it's just a mess, and even people who do, it's a mishmash.
I think Sarah had
Yeah,
up next. Sarah?
Sarah.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for this. Yeah, fantastic presentation. Great to know folks are working on this. My question is, yeah, and I don't know if this is maybe something from you talked about with podcast folks or neuroscientist folks, like if there's any sort of set of testing or like clinical like doctors who have a set system that they can go through, because like I'm about a year and a half out, and so like I've made progress in some areas, and then like when I try to work on one area, now I'm having this cascade of like additional things that are coming back or like new or harder. And so it's kind of hard because like for my case, like for example, like vision therapy seems to be causing some additional like symptoms, but if I can't do the vision therapy, then it stops me in other ways. But then if the headaches are like too bad, then you can't do anything. And so it seems really tough to have someone who's like not just a specialist in one area, but who can help like identify where those like core or other, I don't really have the language
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that, but you know, like, yeah. So I was wondering if there's any like clinicians who are working on this or research, like for assessing and for like how to know when you're pressing on different things that are causing a cascade of symptoms. So if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, it makes yes, it makes sense. And yes, that was also what I did to myself. And it took me, the basic thing I'm going to get to towards the second and third talk is to learn to not push your limit if you can. Learn to not get to that point where other things have been activated and the whole thing falls apart. I've met some clinicians that talk about that, but they don't understand the cascade. And maybe your term of cascade is the same term for ripples, but needless to say, I could reference you to a few clinicians that I have met. Sadly, I can count on one hand the clinicians that I'm like, oh, they seem to get it. But then part of it is it's like recognizing that the relearning and rebuilding, it takes a lot longer, and it's almost like certain things have to be, or at least I speak from my experience, certain things have to be solidified and made really stable to go to the next step. And then if you go too far and bite off more you can chew, the whole thing falls apart again. And then there's this balance with restoratives and with the ability to not get to that fatigue point. But I haven't so Karen McAvoy, I would say, is the best clinician that I've met, and I talk to her semi-regularly. Some other good ones I think are out there. The National Academy of Science report that I spoke about, it seems to suggest there's good and bad. And then I haven't met enough of the good, but I think they're out there. So where are you? What, or you don't have to say, but if you're in
The Seattle area.
yeah. So ultimately, I don't know of anyone great in this area, but I think they are here, and I think the University of Washington has some good people. I wish I could refer you to somebody, but I'll send you a list. There's like a really good group in Utah. There's a really good group. Karen McAvoy's in Colorado. There's one guy is in New York, and it's like these sporadic places where there's cognitive FX is another good group, and they'll help to a certain extent, but the learning to not go too far was kind of a magical step in my recovery. And I have two podcasts where I recorded similar people learning not to push themselves to the limit was another key factor for having the cascade not happen. And the progression was really, really slow. I say 7 years, but really it's 7 to 11 years where I felt like, okay, I'm gaining things back. And across those 7 years, things kept changing. So that's going to be the part 2 and part 3 of this talk series, actually. And in that sense, I wish I never had anyone that was like, oh, thank you. Now I understand. Now you've assessed me. And then I want to say that's the good side of what I'm trying to explain. The bad side, the other day at one of the groups, we were talking about neuropsychological testing, and everyone had a traumatic experience and a horrible example, and it was sad. But I'm going to call them out to a certain extent because their tests, I've learned, are not really built for brain injury. They're trying to extrapolate from other disorders and other diseases. So there's a lot of ways to find improper assessment, and it's harder to find proper assessment. But cognitive FX, Karen McAvoy is at the ASHA clinic, and there's a few other ones. I can try to remember them. But yeah, it's been really hard, and that's part of why I'm getting into this, because it's like people don't understand what we're dealing with, and I feel now confident enough that I've met so many people that like that it's hard to find that kind of support. I don't know if it exists. It becomes
Thank
part
you so
of our
much.
responsibility. Yeah. Sorry, I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. No, that was really helpful. I like, yeah, thank you. Yep.
Yeah. Next, Maz.
Hey there.
Hi, Maz.
Hey everybody who I don't know, I'm Moz. So I'm past 40 years. And so a few things I don't do well at this time of day. So forgive me if I lapse out and forget what I'm talking about. I wanted to point out about the constancy. For me, it depends. Like, so when we talk about assessing us, a lot of times when I went in to get assessed or even for therapy or anything, I would have to go in the morning because that's the only time I could really function and get back home. And they would see me at that state. And there's this confusion about recovery, where if somebody sees you managing in appearances of being okay, they think you've recovered, and they make, a great attempt to convince you that you've recovered. And that's a very difficult thing to manage. That's part of the invisibleness. But the constancy, I wanted to say that it's constant from day to day to day. Over the 40 years, yes, things have changed, but it depends on what I've been focusing on. So I can work on something, improve on it, but then everything else that I'm not focusing on gets lost. So I could feel like, oh yeah, I'm getting better. I've recovered in some ways. But if I only stay in that category of focus, I'm not realizing, or others aren't realizing, that actually I haven't recovered. I've just shifted my attention to put all my energies of my brain, complete focus on this particular area. And so the constancy, it varies through the day, but that's not to say that it's not constant from day to day to day. And being 40 years out, I actually can say that if I didn't take the meds that I'm on now that address fatigue, that have changed my life and saved my life, I would be like the day after my injury.
Right.
So even though I didn't have words, I had no idea, I couldn't understand language. I couldn't understand, I didn't have memory. There were so many huge things, even though I managed to secure some of those functions, I would say I'm still like the day after, because in all, the basic things that have been altered, I still have to find ways to compensate for. And, that I think those are some critical things to think about, and how we're communicating when you say constancy, because one of the things that I got gaslighted on quite frequently was that a lot of people that I met that had strokes or brain injuries, they were the same from morning to night. But a lot of these folks, they also had people taking care of them. For me, I was a completely different person with the fatigue. I mean, whole different voice, personality, facial expressions. I mean, it just was so dramatic that I, asked my neuropsychologist, do I have multiple personality disorder? Because this is just so bizarre how different I am in functioning and being and even feeling and thinking. And he said, no, that's just the fatigue. So, you touched on the fatigue, but how it relates and the constancy and also the concept of recovery are major factors that I've come across.
So thank you. And so I appreciate always your input, Moz. And I actually had this called the constantness that changes. And then I thought, no, that's too complicated. People aren't going to understand what I'm saying. And I was like,
it's
okay,
hard to come up with
constant.
words.
And then I was like, no, chronic, no, constantness. The constantness that changes is more accurate. And I'm going to use that. And the fatigue is like I always want to curse and I'm not going to curse, but the fatigue, it just changes everything. And it's a drastic thing that I got really good at dragging myself to a place to crash and then I can't move for 3 days. And it's this layer, I look at it like this layer is the brain injury problems, those core problems and ripple problems, these problems overall. The work that I did to restore and rebuild my cognition, my double vision, I never really dealt with the feeling that my mind was not my mind. Rather, that just faded away because I became a different person. Also, the reality around me and the strangeness of the world. This talk is going to turn into another talk I call the bizarreness with brain injury. I'm hoping to put that on in about 2 months, but it's all a big mess. And the fluctuations across the day remind me of how I was, that it changed over 5 years, 7 years, 11 years. That improved and became more like normal, but it's still a battle for me. And what I was trying to say is that the baby step work that I did with addition and subtraction in my head over time allowed me to start to do algebra, allowed me to start to take information into my head. The taking information into my head is before memory, before thinking. That took, I'd say, like 8 years of work. And that's the thing that without support and without the right, at least clinicians to help with that, I think the core problems remain. I just spoke to someone last week where they're like, this is improving, but this hasn't. And this being a different core problem, I don't think those things change. People can adapt. What you have done is amazing and at least a lot of changes to improve your life, but it's still really, really problematic. And without the right support and support from around us, that's never going to change. So that's, I used to write words that I couldn't remember over and over and over and over. I spent 2 years working to restore my memory. My memory still sucks, but it's a lot better than what it was. And then it's like I can't really even explain what I improved. But that's the baby steps and baby steps is what I call that. And that's going to be the third slide, the third presentation where we get into that. But I don't know if it can work for everyone, but I do know that they understood what we were dealing with. I think they would at least be more supportive. So yeah, it's and thank you. I'm gonna change it to the constantness that changes, which is accurate. Yes.
I want to thank you, Dan. You're always phenomenal.
I'm always thinking about this.
You're just, a godsend really to us to have a voice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. Nancy, you have a question? Hi, Nancy.
So starting out, I'd like to say bravo, Daniel. I really like the way you divided this up into these categories. And I'm also looking forward to delving into fatigue.
Yeah, the fatigue is, yeah.
Yeah, and Mars, thank you for your point about confusion of recovery, because I see this as either twofold or bi-directional, because not only is there the confusion of those outside of us of what recovery is going to be needed, but they're misunderstanding that to say, no, look, you've recovered, you're doing well enough in the morning, and they don't grasp it. So it's lots of confusion from lots of directions. And
Yeah.
so anyway, that being said, that's not a question other than I hope the background noise isn't too loud. And thank you. I'm a big fan of your work, Daniel.
Thank you, Nancy. Just so everyone knows, Nancy and I are friends, and also Maz and I have become friends. I moved to Seattle a few years ago. Yeah, it's been a really weird process to get to know people who are dealing with different. It's similar but different. It's like, what are your problems? What are your core problems? And I can imagine what I would have been like without the support of my mom, especially. And the therapies she got me to were not the best, but they were definitely good enough and gave me clues to see what was even wrong with me. But yeah, it's still happening. I'm still having these problems. Different problems now. Okay, anyone else? Anyone else? If
I'm
not,
just going to add the comment that we're friends because of this work, and we met through this work. Weren't friends first.
yes, that is true. Maybe we would have been otherwise, but we would not have met because we met online during the COVID isolation time through one of the groups. All right, I think that this has been really good, and maybe now we can turn off the recording, and if anyone else wants to talk or say anything, I do have to go pick up my kid in about 20 minutes, so
I just wanted to wrap up, Dan. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, so before we fully wrap up, there's just a reminder, this class is happening 3 weeks in a row, which is amazing. So today, next Monday, 13th, and then the following Monday, the 20th, all at the same time, which is 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, which unfortunately, as we're all learning, is now when it gets dark around here. So we'll be having this. The link is the same. If you registered for any of the 3 classes, you should have the same link for all of them. You don't have to register 3 times, just once is fine. I can't thank Dan enough for this. I think you all saw the amount of work that Dan put into this, an incredible amount of work, years of research, years of lived experience, so much commitment. And I just don't even have the words to thank Dan for giving us your time, your energy, your effort. You're talking about fatigue. I know things like this are fatiguing. So we can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough on behalf of the Brain Injury Alliance, on behalf of all of us on this call, and on behalf of the larger community. You're just such a wonderful asset for all of us to have, a wonderful person, and we're lucky to know you. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
So,
Dan.
yeah, so if there are any other questions, oh, and another small plug, which is not as exciting as this, we do actually have another class tomorrow. It's not taught by Dan, but I promise you it will still be amazing. If anyone's interested, it's on our social media. That one doesn't require registration, but it's on post-concussion syndrome and cervical spine dysfunction. It's taught by I'm forgetting her name, Dr. Aisha Santos. And it's going to be a really great class. That's from noon to 1, so it's a little bit of a different time. And the link is in our social media. So if you want to attend that, that's great. Also free to attend. Also will be recorded. Also will show up on our YouTube channel. And as I said in the chat, we will try to get all of Dan's classes, or all the classes we teach, up by the next day. So if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, if you have any thoughts, feel free to reach out to myself or Dan. And we thank you all for attending. And Dan, thank you again for just being awesome. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, thank you all too.
Great.
I'm not going to talk anymore unless anyone has a question.
Well, I hope everybody has a great evening. Sorry, it's dark out. I can't impact that, but I hope you have a great evening anyway, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob, for your visual comments.